Dr. Mellard is a co-principal investigator for the National Center on Response to Intervention and also serves as the director of the Division in Adult Studies for the Center for Research on Learning at the University of Kansas. Previously, he had similar roles with the OSEP-funded National Research Center on Learning Disabilities. Dr. Mellard co-authored A Practitioner's Guide to Implementing Response to Intervention. His other research activities focus on adolescent and adult reading literacy and the transition of students from adult education into post-secondary studies. Sara Prewett is a program associate at the University of Kansas Center for Research on Learning and works with the National Center on Response to Intervention. Daryl works with the multi-year nationwide evaluation study of RTI practices in middle school settings. We are very fortunate they are sharing their expertise with us today. Let me turn it over to them.
Thank you, Susan. Well, welcome, folks. And if you were in Kansas today, you'd be enjoying another beautiful day. Well, it's not quite beautiful, those snow flurries, but, you know, we had such a great trip to Texas yesterday, our Big Monday trip, that today we're just kind of all glowing. We hope that you are having a great day wherever you are, too. In the course of our presentation today, we'll offer that review of our national perspective on middle school implementation on RTI. As we go along, we've included some of the answers to emailed questions that we previously received. So we hope to get that, and then allowing what time's remaining at the end for addressing other questions that you might be sending to us. So Sara and I weren't the only ones working on this study of RTI. Numerous other staff at KU were part of that effort as well, including several of our graduate research assistants out of the school psychology program. As we begin thinking about RTI, we want to just focus that a little bit on a couple key concepts. And important in that is how RTI doesn't have just one model, and as we review our middle school study, that becomes apparent as well, but rather RTI offers a framework in which school staffs can integrate assessment and intervention procedures, if you will, within that multi-level prevention system. The integration piece of assessment results, whether that's in screening and progress monitoring, is one of those critical elements, because we use that information then in looking at possible interventions and judging the effectiveness of those interventions with the students. One of the challenges, and we'll review multiple challenges evidenced in the schools as we go along, but one of those was just that important element of integration of those results. That posed a significant challenge to our school staffs. When we think a little bit about the agenda for today's webinar, we'll just provide an overview of our research methods, figuring that most folks aren't too interested in the how, but more about what those findings indicated about middle school implementation, and then go to a more specific example of how RTI worked within a particular middle school setting. We know from our review of the literature that we have no experimental studies of an RTI framework in a secondary setting or multiple settings. That is, we can't point to a body of literature that talks about screening and progress monitoring and those multi-level tiers or the decision-making frameworks. So we wanted to begin describing that landscape of implementation through a series of descriptive studies, which is very similar to work that's been done in describing implementation in a high school setting. We want to remind you that On Thursday, the center will also be hosting a webinar on high school implementation of RTI, in which several of us participated with staff from the National High School Center and the Center on Instruction in those descriptive studies. When we began our research project about the description of middle school implementation of RTI, we identified multiple outcomes that we hoped we would be able to achieve. And central to that, again, was painting a picture of the current landscape. That is, what does RTI look like within those settings? And then what seem to be some of the key factors that support that implementation in those settings? If we can get some handle on some of those key factors, we get a better sense of what we might be able to replicate. And then from those settings, talk about some specific exemplary practices, primarily around the screening, the progress monitoring, how the tiered levels of services were developed, implemented, and sustained. Again, the integration piece is a significant challenge within that middle school setting. And then be able to identify some specific settings that illustrate those exemplary practices. So the part of the method of this study of middle schools was to cast a broad net, if you will. Kind of went trolling, if you will, in the waters of middle schools to identify those settings in which they had a full model implemented. And by full model, we meant that they were conducting school-wide screening, that students' progress was monitored on a consistent, objective basis, that students moved through multiple tiers of intervention, and that we had some assessment of the fidelity with which those interventions were being delivered. Just a little bit of an aside, when we looked at the elementary school implementation of RTI, we could see many effective practices, or anyway, practices that we thought were effective. But as we studied those more carefully, we had a greater deal of difficulty of making a distinction among those that were being implemented effectively or those that, well, the school staff might say they did implement, but you know, the level of implementation, the consistency with which those practices were being implemented became a larger question as we dove beneath the surface. Well, as we went trolling for those middle schools, we identified 42 during last year, during the academic year, last year, looking across, I think what we have, 18 states in those settings as well. So the method of identifying the model practices, we put those 42 middle schools, or as you can see, through a series of phases. The larger set was identifying who said that they were implementing RTI, and for that we had about 85 schools. And then as we began screening, we lost half of those because in a sense they did not have the full model in place, or were lacking some of the data to describe that more fully implemented model. As we kind of went further or deeper into their implementation, again, more of those sites, so those 42 sites dropped out. We went to 30, where we were able to conduct phone interviews regarding their implementation of screening and progress monitoring and tiered interventions. Then, you know, that point, you see there was a significant drop again. Better than half of those schools dropped out, in part because of, I want to try to say this nicely, maybe it just wasn't well enough described so that we could give an accurate description to audiences such as yourselves about the practice. So that became a key element. That is, could we look at the practice and have it described sufficiently so that someone would know how to replicate it, for example. And then we went to the next level involving those 12 schools, saying, well, what does the student data tell us? What's the quality of student outcomes among those settings? And then as we looked more carefully at the student data, realized that really we had 6 where we wanted to make on-site visits and, again, take a more careful, in-depth look at their implementation. So largely what we'll be describing today would be practices from those 30 schools, but when it comes down to who was exemplary, it's much closer to that group of 6 for whom we're going to say, yes, those practices make sense to us, and we want to look more carefully or describe that for you. So roughly that was the last year's effort at taking those 85 schools through our multiple steps of screening ourselves. Sara will now kind of get to the meat of what were the important findings from those multiple schools.
Thank you, Daryl, for doing such a great job describing what we just did. It made it sound so easy. Well, most of the schools we talked to followed a 6th to 8th grade model. So we had a question before we even started about what grades we were looking at, and we really were seeing grades 6 through 8 for the most part. And as you can see at the first bullet on the slide, we were talking with schools that were in various different places in their implementation process, from less than a year, so just beginning, all the way up to 6 years, so they have a chance to put the practices in place. With those schools, they were all over the map in terms of how they were implementing RTI, were they putting these components in place. And what we generally found is that most of the time they started with one classroom, so just reading in 6th grade, or they started with just one component, so putting in screening, say, and would go from there. What everybody talked about a lot was this emphasis on building the culture. So a key piece is talking to your staff, getting your staff on board, having everybody understand what RTI is and what all of the components are that you want to put in place, and engaging the students in that process. So the students should also be having this conversation around data collection and understanding what it is that's happening in their school. So if a student is found to be at risk from your screening process, that student should understand why and why that student is being put into an intervention classroom. And then to understand their own progress monitoring data. So having the students and staff engaged in the whole process provides this systemic leadership, which is essential, and creates buy-in for your school. So I'm going to talk specifically now about some of the things we found with those key components that Daryl mentioned. So we focused on screening, progress monitoring, tiered interventions, database decision-making, and fidelity practices when we were talking with these schools. And I know that many of you are very interested in how these pieces are being put in place in middle schools. With the screening practices, it's often the first thing that schools do put in place, and it might be the easiest because it's fairly straightforward. You do need to find a tool that will work for your school and for the components or the content areas that you want to put in place. But it's usually the thing that schools find the easiest to establish. Schools emphasize that the screening data is an essential piece, because without it, they don't even know how to begin identifying which students need interventions. So it becomes the foundational component. And as you'll see on the second bullet, the majority of our schools were screening 3 times each year. So they looked at their calendar at the beginning of the year and found a time, a week in September, a week in January, and a week in May that worked for them to screen all the students in their school. The screening measures, the actual tools that they used, really varied by school. You can see a couple of common ones. A lot of people are using Ames Web, maps, CBNs, and state assessments. But even more so, a lot of people are using multiple measures. So they're not just using Ames Web or a oral reading fluency measure, but they're using that in combination with comprehension questions from a tool like Jamestown. So they're gathering multiple data points to really see where their students are struggling. So once schools have screening practices in place, the next set of data that they need to really be collecting is this progress monitoring piece that Daryl discussed. While schools said that screening is essential, they also were talking about how they couldn't live without the progress monitoring data, because if they didn't have the data from progress monitoring, they don't know whether or not the interventions they've put into place are working or not. So it's even though it is one of the most important pieces, it was also one of the most varied pieces or components, and it was one of the most challenging for schools because, again, they needed measures that worked and worked well and measured what they wanted to measure, but they also needed to find a schedule for each of their tiers or levels. Most schools don't progress monitor at all in the primary level of prevention, so the general education, although a few do, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. The secondary level of intervention, everybody is pretty much progress monitoring to some degree, either weekly all the way up to monthly, although I don't think there was a consensus at all at how often was the best. And then with the tertiary level, it ranged from daily to twice a month. So what we are seeing that as you step up intensity, you're stepping up the frequency of progress monitoring. And Daryl has something he'd like to say about that.
It becomes a challenge for us to judge the efficacy of an intervention if we're waiting to progress monitor on a month basis. That's too much intervention being delivered without the feedback as to its effectiveness. We need to have better indicators of whether or not that intervention is going to be working for our students, a more frequent basis, and particularly if we move to a behavioral intervention with students with severe persistent behavioral difficulties, pretend it was self-injurious or injurious to others. We need a high frequency of progress monitoring there to know whether or not we're intervening successfully or not. So there's the range of practice that Sara described certainly poses some challenges with that implementation.
And really, I think the range is indicative of the fact that people are struggling to know themselves what is the best for their school and their schedules and their time and their staff and their resources. So this was one of the components, I think, that all schools are still tweaking. Even if they have something in place, they're constantly looking at it and trying to make sure that it's what they need to have. So it's something that schools really need to take a hard look at.
And remember, this is with the 30 schools not our exemplary practices, because certainly as we moved into the more exemplary practices, there was a higher frequency of progress monitoring.
So as schools are collecting all of this data, what do they do with it? Well, you're making decisions about where students should be placed, and how do you make those decisions? This was something we heard from a lot of different administrators, that now that they've got all these numbers, how do they use them? Well, and what's very promising is that most schools decided that they can't make this decision, place this decision-making process on one person or one staff. They need to do it in a group setting. So most of the time, a lot of these schools we're seeing are meeting weekly or biweekly or monthly to make sure that they're constantly looking at the data that they're collecting. So placement decisions, if you have your screener is indicating that you have 20 students that really need some reading intervention, this team meeting will be a place that students or your RTI leadership team can make those decisions on where best to put these students. A lot of times, as you see from the list of the common sources, people aren't just looking at the screening scores, but they are looking at an entire list of different things. They're also looking at grades, and they're looking at failure to respond to prior other interventions, and they're also looking at some of the state assessment scores. So when you're talking about a student in these team settings, they're looking at a whole range of data rather than just one piece. So once that decision has been made to place somebody into an intervention of some kind, the schools have to have a system put into place. Well, this is another rather difficult area that schools are struggling with that we've seen, because they do need to be innovative with their schedules, their time, and their staff, and their resources. But what we're finding is that they are being incredibly innovative and finding ways to make it happen. One of the really promising findings that we discovered is that students who indicate that they're at risk receive interventions within 1 week to 1 month after identification from a screener. So they're getting those interventions really quickly. And in the secondary level, they have a very small class size, 10 to 15, and in the tertiary level, it's even smaller, 4 to 5 students per teacher. And most schools and middle schools include their special education students throughout all levels of their intervention. There are a few who consider special ed their highest tier, tier 3 or tier 4, but for the most part, those special ed students are receiving services throughout all interventions. So if they actually could benefit from a secondary level intervention, they get that service. When we're speaking about interventions, I think it's very easy to skip general education entirely and focus on how do you put in secondary or tertiary level interventions. But especially with those 6 schools that we thought were particularly exemplary, we found that they really focused on making sure that their general education curriculum is the best that they can possibly make it. They said, this is pivotal, this is key. If you want to be able to serve those numbers of secondary and tertiary students, you have to make sure that you are reaching everybody you can in your general education setting. And in fact, in one of our schools, she said that they knew they had a math problem, a general education math problem, so they put all of their resources first into solving that problem and then worried about putting secondary interventions in place. So another thing that we saw across the board that was common was that these schools really engage their students in their learning. And while that sounds very commonsensical, of course we do that, what we were actually seeing when we were observing is that every student knows their objectives. They know exactly what it is that they're supposed to be learning. It's written on the board. They can repeat it back to you. They're very involved in their goals and objectives and what it is that what they're doing and how they make those connections across their classes. Another key piece is that there's this common culture of every staff person embraces every student, and every teacher is responsible for every student's learning. And it's less of a, well, I'm a science teacher and I taught the lesson, they should have gotten it, to I'm going to teach them. I'm going to make sure that they got it. And finally, one of the things that we really heard from is particularly that person who told me that they had a math problem was now they make sure that all of their math classes are standardized. So all of the 6th grade math classes are teaching the exact same thing at the exact same time. There isn't a discrepancy. If you go into, if a student moves from one class to another, they will be receiving the same lesson. So with our secondary interventions, and I think this is where people are incredibly interested to know what we found. We found that the key pieces that we want to talk about that we think are difficult for people to put in place are the schedule, the delivery, the frequency, and the duration. For the most part with secondary interventions, people are scheduling those classes during elective time or already existing flex time. So during elective time, these kids are getting taken out of choir or math or band to be put into the math intervention. And some schools already have this flex period where they, everybody's someplace, but it's a little bit more flexible, so they can use that time for an intervention. Most of the time, general education teachers are teaching the secondary interventions. Sometimes you are using a combination of general ed and special ed. Most classes are being taught daily, and they're being taught for a class period. So our duration is a lot. You'll see our frequency ranges from 15 to 180 minutes. But what that means is that most of these are actually a class length, a class period long. Now, we actually got a question in advance about what interventions are people using, and are there any good reading interventions to use? Well, I don't think we can promote any specific intervention, but we can point you to the What Works Clearinghouse and the
Best Evidence Encyclopedia.
The Best Evidence Encyclopedia, and so you can do some research on what might fit your school. And what I can also tell you is that schools are reaching in deep into their toolboxes to find what they can find to provide these interventions. So they're using a variety of different kinds of tools, like some are using strategic learning models, writing labs, programs like language exclamation, read naturally, sort of success, let's read, and a lot of others too. And then others are trying to increase the intensity by doing things like reteaching the core material by using smaller class sizes, differentiating the instruction, using different instructors, using different strategies, and things like peer tutoring. So it's really diverse. I think what schools are doing when they're really finding a good method is they're already looking at what they have that exists in their toolbox and figuring out what the students need and able to structure their classes around those things. So when we get to tertiary level interventions, it gets a little bit more complicated for schools to schedule these. These are really pretty small groups with most schools are having to individualize the instruction for these 2 or 3 kids. They're occurring most often in place of core classes. So as one principal told me, if they can't read, then they're not going to understand what's going on in social studies. So I'd rather take them out of social studies to make sure that they're getting the reading instruction they need. Other schools do have the option of taking them out of elective classes, but again, that's usually now they're out of they're missing 2 elective classes in reading 3 times a day. So I'm not. I think some schools are deciding that that's not their best method. Most of the time, special educators are the teachers providing this intervention. Some schools actually have hired RTI interventionists to deliver this instruction. The tertiary interventions occur daily for the most part, and they're usually about a class period long. And a lot of times these schools are having the tertiary kids in a secondary class and a tertiary class, so they are getting those 3 periods a day of reading or math. Some of the resources that they're using to provide these tertiary interventions are things that the middle schools already have for their special ed classes. They're using programs like Connecting Math or Connecting Reading. They're using corrective math and corrective reading. They're using Key Math. They're using Wilson. So they're using the same kinds of tools that they were already using for their special education classes. And again, they're most of the time they're taking every resource that they already have and letting all the teachers know, all the staff know what it is that they have in their toolbox of resources and figuring out what works best for which students. So this is very individualized instruction. And now I'm going to let Daryl talk about fidelity for a little while. Okay, just a few minutes.
All right, so when we move into the discussion about fidelity of implementation or treatment integrity, you note that we're really only talking about performance in 8 of our 12 schools. The other schools may have something on fidelity, again, but because the other components were not as well developed or implemented, we didn't take time trying to understand what they were what their practices were around fidelity. So anyway, for 8 of our schools, they look at fidelity from the elements of adherence and instructional quality, meaning is the instruction, is the curriculum appropriate and being delivered as intended, and then are the assessments, the screening and the progress monitoring, being delivered as intended? Are the standardized procedures being followed? So most of our schools in this group indicated that this is an area in which they need to do more work. It's a growing area, and it's complicated in part because we don't have as good a conceptual models around fidelity. Though I'm pleased to, if you haven't seen the most recent issue of School Psych Review, that issue included several articles around treatment integrity, instructional fidelity that may be informative to you as well. So we have conceptual frameworks that we need to develop, and assessment instruments of fidelity are also incomplete. We aren't always user-friendly in that. And then, again, the bigger issue is about culture. We really need to develop a point of view that assessing fidelity is important for looking at the effectiveness of our programs and not being stuck on it as just an element of personnel evaluation. One of our middle schools, Old Vail Middle School out of Arizona, use these procedures to look at their degree of fidelity. And you'll see a mix of methods on this list of observations and student products, for example. You see a mix of staff who are involved in this, and you'll see, again, variation in what the focus. So they're developing a broad framework around fidelity of implementation, and I think that's reflected in the mix of methods and staff who are being involved in this. That's a wise way to go, we believe. You also see variation then on the frequency with which those fidelity measures are being completed. Two critical elements. Be sure that the school has an opportunity not only to collect the fidelity measures, but to provide feedback to the instructor. It isn't so much just getting the data, but being able to give feedback to the instructor, and then being able to support the instructor in the area in which fidelity may not be optimal. Of course, figuring out what's optimal is another decision point for the team. But we've got to be able to give support. Otherwise, it just looks punitive. It's like, well, you didn't do this. You didn't give the feedback. You did not cue the students. You didn't adhere to the curriculum guide, and so on. We've got to be able to support the instructional staff to be solid in their implementation as well. When we looked at the key structures within our successful schools, all right, these come through this list of 4 bullets. And notice how important kind of the culture or the social interaction is reflected in this list, that sense of leadership. And as Sara noted earlier, the systemic leadership, so that everyone's on board or at least understands the direction, the intent of the RTI framework. That's more complicated than any one of our components for implementation. It's much more complicated than putting a screening measure in practice. But getting everybody to buy into using screening data to make decisions is more difficult. Those successful schools routinized, if you will, some of their practices so that they have their RTI practices as part of their agenda. This is what we do. This is how we conduct business. We have these weekly meetings. We gather these data in making decisions. That's the point about having a culture, a supported culture, and having that use of the RTI framework for making decisions. This is the agenda for our school. Most started small. Most of those schools started small with a few staff members in one grade or one content area. Now, curiously, when we did this work with elementary schools, they had the same pattern of starting small with the staff who were interested. But uniformly, they said they wished they had started broad. That is, not trying to grow from a few folks to the whole school, but rather to get folks on board at the very beginning. So it's an interesting observation in contrast. But and maybe these middle school staff at some point would say, oh, we should have started with everyone at least in some way as well. And then being able to gain support of the staff about using the data. There's this 2 points of view. Do you want to wow everyone with the testimony and the student data to convince them to come on board, or should we just make the arguments up front and try to deal with it from a philosophical point of view? Our sense is you need to have a blend of both. Be sure that everybody gets engaged. Some of the consistent findings across the 30 schools, again, remember we started with 85 and we whittled that down to 42 and then 30. So for those 30 schools, these were generally consistent and in some ways differentiated the 30 and the more exemplary, or the schools with more exemplary practices when we went on down to 12 and 6. But these schools had screening in place, they had some progress monitoring system, and at least some sense about a secondary level intervention. Again, as Sara indicated, they provided those interventions within their structure of classes, their class schedule. Many of the schools struggled with identifying or developing the staff's skills and identifying their resources for that tertiary level of intervention. And that's a significant question, I believe, for all of us. How do we address the needs of our learners who are least responsive to our otherwise proven interventions? That's a significant challenge. The schools focused on reading, math, and behavior. And occasionally we saw some evidence about working in writing and then content areas such as science and social studies. But literacy, numeracy, reading literacy and numeracy were significant areas. And we should also mention how important the work of the positive behavioral instructional support is. Their center is central to the work around RTI, and some folks found that the behavior was an easier way to get staff on board rather than the discussion about academics as well. And you can leave it to you to imagine why that might be as well. So RTI has multiple components, and we've reviewed some of those with you. But again, what became the greatest challenge was to change the thinking. The staff reported the change in culture, how we interacted, how we thought about students became critical for us. And I think that's illustrated in the points made on this slide. A point for debate is, are we talking about remediation or prevention? And certainly a prevention issue is preventing dropout as well. The schools had numerous challenges. Some of those involved establishing rubrics such as integrating screening measures. Sara reported how schools would use multiple screening measures or multiple progress monitoring measures. Well, how do you weight those multiple scores? Which do you consider to be most accurate? Those are challenges that the schools confronted. Fundamentally, they said we have to get a hold of our schedule. We realized we had many false starts, but once we decided that setting aside time for secondary and tertiary level interventions became the primary, the most fundamental decisions that we made for intervening, life became a whole lot easier. But easier, that's a relative term too, Maybe we can look at the amount of snow in Kansas and say, oh, there's quite a bit, but nothing compared to the East Coast either. So there is that notion of variation. As we look ahead, we know that finding appropriate assessments and interventions will continue to be a challenge, as well as taking advantages of the resources that are available to them. In early December, we met with representatives of 5 of our 6 sites with exemplary practices, and they made a number of confirmatory statements. It is possible for schools to implement RTI. We found it very important for us to look at the resources that were available to us within our school, and that is making better use of what was available to us, because they didn't have additional funding for their implementation. To consider innovations, how do we use those better? Well, that was an innovation. But then use the student data to help us make decisions about what's working and what isn't. Leadership does not reside with the building administrator, but is shared, is systemic. We have to have our leadership team on board to be able to make this work. And to bring staff along, yes, we need professional development, but we need ongoing coaching to make that work as well. Sara's going to walk you through more about Old Vail Middle School, one of our sites where we feel like there's a good exemplary set of practices.
Well, thank you, Daryl. And Old Vail is located in Vail, Arizona. I think you mentioned that a little bit earlier. It's near Tucson, so you can think warm thoughts as you're thinking about Old Vail. They're a pretty middle-class population, but what's exciting about them is that they have been implementing for the past 5 years. So they've been doing this. This is now part of their everyday procedures. It began as a district-led initiative in their elementary schools, and the principal of Old Vail was an elementary school principal when RTI began there. So she had the advanced knowledge when she went to the middle school, so she was able to help facilitate the implementation at the middle level. And what's really exciting about this is they have met AYP every year since RTI implementation, so if you want some student outcome data, there it is for them. We're going to kind of talk through this really quickly. I've put up a quick flow chart for those of you who are visual learners. And this is their basic process. It looks a little bit complex, but you screen all of your students. That data goes to the RTI leadership team. There are decision rules that are in place. So did students score above the cut scores? If they did, they're still in general ed. They don't need any further action. If they didn't, they get an additional set of assessments. They can't do, won't do, which is a behavioral assessment. And if it's simply a won't do, they have a set of behavioral interventions for those students. If those students scoring below the cut scores are a can't do, they stay in Tier 1, but they get some additional interventions and their progress monitored weekly. So in Tier 1, they have these sets of interventions that are things like peer tutoring and direct instruction. If that progress monitoring data shows that those students in Tier 1 interventions didn't respond, thank you, Daryl, they're given Tier 2 interventions. So those Tier 2 interventions, those kids are progress monitored daily. If that data shows that they did respond, they can either be put back in general education, or they can continue with Tier 2 until they're to the level of mastery, in which case they go back to general ed. Or if they really are not responding to any of the interventions, they can get a special education evaluation and go to Tier 3. So in Old Vail, Tier 3 is synonymous with special ed, and they do use the RTI data as one piece of data during that special education evaluation. So we're not going to leave it at that. We'll give you a little bit more information about Old Vail. For their screener, they're using MACE for their reading, which is a number of correctly circled words in 2 minutes. For math, they're using a mixed basic fact CBM, and for writing, it's a correct writing sequence CBM. If students score below their cut score, they'll get the can't do, won't do assessment, and they'll do an oral reading fluency assessment. They do these screeners 3 times a year by a 3-person team. It's, as I mentioned before, it's a set time, so all students in September, January, and May are screened within the same week. And then when the screening results indicate that a student is struggling, the intervention is implemented, and then the student is progress monitored. So what's really exciting about Old Vail is that they are progress monitoring in the primary level, in Tier 1. Those students receiving interventions aren't automatically put into secondary. They have a chance to go ahead and reach mastery. And of course, they have a system in place to move to secondary interventions pretty quickly if indeed they need it, if they aren't responding to those primary level interventions. So they also have in place daily progress monitoring. So they know they have all of those data points to track very closely how the students are doing with their interventions, so they can move them quickly into programs that they need. With the primary level of instruction during general education, here's a little graph that you can see about what it is that they're doing. Reading, writing, and math is provided extensively each day for quite a bit of time. They are using a co-teaching model with both general educators and special educators teaching the students. So a lot of the tertiary level interventions, so the special education students, are receiving a lot of the same instruction in the primary level classes. Let me just move on real fast. And their secondary level interventions are a class period long. They're using problem solving to determine which students need which interventions. So they are actually focused on each student's problem area when they're teaching. And as you notice at the very bottom bullet, the student-teacher ratio is pretty small for their secondary level interventions. And this is just something that their structure allows them to do. So even though this is Tier 2, they are able to get that intensive and specific of instruction at the secondary level. Again, I mentioned when we were looking at the flow chart that their tertiary level is special ed, and those students receive at least 45 minutes a day, but sometimes it's up to 3 class periods of intervention, which is 140 minutes of instruction in their problem area. And these are very specific interventions for those students. So what are our next steps? I know I raced through the Old Vail description. We're quickly running out of time, but I wanted to give you that description just so you could know that this is actually working well in a school setting. And what we want to do next to help everybody wants to know how to do this in middle schools is to produce some documents. And where I really want you to notice is the third bullet under what we're going to produce. We have some topical video clips from these practitioners that we hope to have finished by the end of this month and on the RTI for Success website. These practitioners are our principals who are putting RTI in place in these middle schools, and they're talking about how they did it. And it's really well worth your time. I mean, Daryl and I can talk all we want about what we saw, but I think until you hear it from their mouths, that's what's powerful. And we're going to get some more documents out for schools to use to help them with this process. And we do hope to have a lot of things at your fingertips in the next few months. And another thing for you to look for is one of our colleagues, Evelyn Johnson, and with Lori Smith and Monica Harris, have just produced very recently this How to RTI Works in Secondary Schools book. And Lori Smith was one of our principals that we talked with. So it's very exciting to see that she has written about her practices. So that is the end of our talk, and we have a lot of questions that we had hoped to get to, so we're going to try to maybe answer a couple before we're done with our time.
How is primary functional RTI different than in the middle school? So the first question seems to say, how is the primary function of RTI different than at the middle school level? And maybe that's in comparison to elementary school. So here we're less concerned about predicting who is at risk, which is the function in a primary school setting, to saying we have a history of students who have not been successful, and now how do we intervene and monitor the effectiveness? But the prediction question shifts from academic maybe to who would we predict is at risk for dropping out. So again, that would be a distinction between elementary schools versus middle schools as well. Are there different standard protocols or approaches to help educators analyze multiple sources of data in determining student needs? Well, we would encourage you to only assess with instruments for which you know how you can use those results. Also recognizing that there are state assessments that you have to complete as well, but look for an integration of those results with what you're doing. Given the variation, we have no standard protocol for that integration, but trust that you will be monitoring students' performance and making some judgments about the accuracy of those measures that you're using. We realize that the more proximal those measures are to what's being instructed within the classroom, the much better off you will be as well. Can participants get flow charts or other information about the case? Well, that's part of the material that will be posted.
Yes, that will be on the website, I think pretty quickly after our talk today. So you will have access to all of these slides. And we are putting out a lot of materials based on all of this information that will be more in depth for everybody, and all of that is going to be posted as we get it ready. So I would say keep checking back this spring, and we'll be putting up these materials for you.
Well, the other part is those video clips that Sara mentioned. Those are great. They're much better than listening to us.
Yes.
and they're identified by topic as well, and guidance questions.
So we have a question on how are student behaviors addressed during intervention time. For example, some students are resistant to the interventions because they aren't getting a grade for it anyway. And we've talked a lot with practitioners about integrating both PBIS and RTI at the same time. And so a lot of people are doing both. I mean, they're putting in all of the PBIS structures, so it's becoming a culture in their school that these are the expectations, and this is how it looks in our classrooms, and this is how it looks in the hallway, and this is how it looks in the gym, and in the intervention classes. But the other finding that was reiterated over and over again was that once you're teaching to the level of the student's learning ability and needs, those behaviors dropped off dramatically without the behavior interventions. So it was something that anecdotally we were hearing over and over again, that without an actual behavior intervention, the behaviors were ending anyway.
I think that's all the time we have for questions. You know that we have a lot more questions that are unanswered, and we want to let everybody know that we will be getting replies to them via posted on the website. So please check back later for that.
Send $5 with each of your questions.
We'd like to thank Dr. Mellard and Sara for sharing their presentation today. If you would like to print a copy of the PowerPoint slides from today's presentation, you may do so by clicking on the small printer icon at the bottom right-hand side of your screen. This will allow you to print to PDF. The slides will also be available on the National Center on Response to Intervention's website. More information is available at www.rti4success.org, and that's the number 4 in there. If you have any additional questions about RTI in middle schools, please email them to us at rtiwebinars@air.org, and we will send replies directly back to you. We hope that you will join us for our next webinar, State RTI Initiatives, Use of Coaching, which is presented by Dr. Jim Knight on March 3rd, 2010 at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. We'd appreciate your feedback about today's session. Please take a few minutes to complete the webinar evaluation that you see on the screen. We value your feedback, and ultimately, your suggestions will assist us in making decisions for future webinars. Once again, thank you for participating today.
Ladies and gentlemen, that does conclude the conference call for today. We'd like to thank you for your participation and ask that you please disconnect your lines. Thank you and have a great day, everyone.